Good afternoon, Lisa. Welcome to the Grace Enough podcast.
Thank you. It's a joy and honor to be with you.
Well, I do, like I said earlier, appreciate your time. And I want to just dive into the conversation because there's so much we could talk about, but we do have limited time. And so you are releasing a new book, Good Boundaries and Goodbyes. And I want to share a quote that you open with in the book. And it says, as we open up to each other, the deeper we connect, the more vulnerable we become. The more vulnerable we become, the more exposed the tender places are. And so, share as much or as little of your personal experience that led to the writing of this book and really why it is worth it to put yourself out there.
Well, I think anytime my pain is used for some kind of good, it actually increases my healing even more because I can
Mm,
see that it wasn't for nothing and it was not being wasted. And I'm just very determined that if I had to walk through this, then I want to make the devil regret that he ever messed with a girl like me. I want God to get some kind of good glory from this because it's really been awful.
yeah.
And the past 8 years of my life were something that I never saw coming. And it was so challenging, I think, because there were moments of such hope and then followed by extreme heartbreak, and then a little more hope, and then more extreme heartbreak, and then a little more hope and more extreme heartbreak. And the journey was just long and it was brutal. And then it ended in a way that I had begged God for it not
Yeah.
to. And so I experienced the death of my marriage, and it was the deepest pain I have ever known.
Mm,
It also created a lot of loneliness.
yeah.
And I went from living in a house with 7 people,
I
me,
was
my
going to say you have kids and they're all adults now too. So
Right.
that's a whole like another whammy.
Yeah. So it was like 5 kids. And so everything was always loud and noisy. And I loved the sounds of a
Mm,
family. And then it feels like one day I woke up and my kids had grown up and they
yeah.
had moved out. And then my husband moved out. And it was just deafening silence. And
Mm,
I think anybody that's walked through relationship turmoil, trauma, and even having to say really hard goodbyes, they would understand this. And when I look back, I can see now, I wish I would have had this book that I've written, Good Boundaries and Goodbyes.
mhm.
I wish I would have had it 8 years ago
Mm.
because I think it would have helped give me biblical confidence and emotional fortitude to draw really healthy boundaries. And I just really wish I would have had it.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting when you think about it in terms of what can look back at now, right? And see, like, oh, maybe if I would have been able to set healthy boundaries, then maybe something else would have happened. But that's not really the goal, even in that, right? In the sense of you don't know.
That's right.
Um, but it keeps you healthier.
That's right. And my counselor is always reminding me, um, when you know better, you do better.
Mm,
And so he always reminds me, Lisa, you did the best you could with what you had.
yeah.
But now that you know better, you can do better.
Mm,
And I am doing better. You
yeah.
know, I can say that, I don't know that I'll ever stop grieving the loss of my marriage.
Yeah.
But what I can say now is I've accepted it.
Mm,
And I've worked really hard to work through what I've walked through.
mm.
And I've done the good work of not just blaming and assigning myself the victim mentality,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
but instead I've acknowledged what was definitely something that should have never happened. There were choices that were made that were not my own, that
Mm,
created an unbiblical dynamic and an unsustainable relationship.
yeah.
So I can set that right here. And I can also acknowledge now there are some things I need to work on.
Yeah.
And boundaries was a big thing I needed to work on.
Yeah.
So I am seeing so many glimpses of hope now and so much good, healthy, emotional fortitude and biblical confidence in myself. And
Mm,
I like that in me. I really
yeah.
do.
Well, so as we talk about boundaries, it's an interesting topic because why do you think that we sometimes can view it almost as unchristian to really interact with people in this way?
I think it's because we don't have an understanding that boundaries aren't just a good idea, they're God's idea. And when we look at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis 1, God established the foundations of the world using boundaries.
Yeah.
He separated the light from the darkness, he separated the sky from the sea, he separated
Mhm.
the land from the water. And all of those are examples of physical boundaries. Then, when we get into Genesis 2, the first recorded conversation between God and man, it was on the subject matter of a boundary.
Mm,
Think of all the topics that God could have chosen to make the focus of that first conversation, but God chose a boundary, and how God communicated the boundary was really telling as well. God said to Adam, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden." So the first thing I notice is God is establishing boundary lines so that we know where the freedom is.
that's right.
And when
That's
we know
true.
where the boundary lines are, we can run freely between the boundary lines and not be so hesitant and nervous about, can I do this? Can I do that? Should I step here? Should I not step here?
Mhm.
And then that verse goes on to say from Genesis chapter 2, after God says, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but here comes
Mhm.
the restriction, if you will, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or you will
Mm,
die. Well, when we see that it wasn't just restriction that was happening here, God was establishing this boundary for protection.
yeah.
God has modeled boundaries, give us a way to communicate freedom. What is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what we will tolerate, what we won't tolerate. And God allows us to put some restrictions in place for the protection of
Mhm.
all parties and to have a fighting chance to keep this relationship healthy.
Yeah. I mean, it's what I even say sometimes when I'm talking to people about the law and how it can just seem so horrible and bad. And I'm like, but if you really start digging in, you're going to see that the law a lot of times really was for protection of the people. He wasn't saying, go outside of the city gates for no reason. It was
That's right.
because they didn't have modern medicine. So we really couldn't sleep in the same house. Like it was a different time. And if we would pursue boundaries in a healthy way, but what happens as humans is a lot of times we wait until it's too far, right? To start saying, "Oh my gosh, I've let it go too far."
There's two words that I think are important to consider. And I actually got these two words from how God established the temple.
Mm,
God gave access to certain people,
yep,
but not all people. And it wasn't because he valued this group over another
that's
group.
right.
It's because he required additional responsibility
Mhm,
for the people who had additional access. And
yep,
by the time we get to the Holy of Holies in the temple, God only allowed access to one person, the high priest, and it was once a year for him to make atonement for the people. But he
mhm,
also had to demonstrate the highest level of responsibility to be
that's right.
perfectly cleansed and purified, or he would suffer the most dramatic consequence. He would drop
Mhm,
dead.
mhm,
So when I started to consider access and responsibility, it started to dawn on me, this is what I need to consider too.
mm.
So many times I've given level 10 access to people physically,
Oh, yeah.
financially, relationally, emotionally. I've given level 10 access to someone that is only willing or capable of demonstrating level 3 responsibility.
Whew,
And
yeah,
the distance between those, that's where you find relational turmoil, chaos, and potential dysfunction. That's where you see the need for a boundary. It used to be that I thought I need to put a boundary on this person to make them increase their responsibility up to the level of access that I've given them.
Mhm.
Certainly, you can have a healthy conversation, and healthy people respect healthy boundaries, and they may lift up their area of responsibility. But if this person is unwilling or incapable of anything more than demonstrating level 3 responsibility,
Yeah,
putting a boundary on them won't help if they don't desire to be more responsible.
it's
So
true.
what we have to do is not put a boundary on them. We have to put a boundary on ourselves in this situation and make the choice to reduce the access that we're granting them down to the level of demonstrated responsibility that they're bringing.
Yeah, it is so true, and being someone who has been in a very dysfunctional, unhealthy relationship, not spousal, but very close family member, it is true. I mean, there comes a point when you do have to say, "Okay, I've got to set the boundary around myself because this is not changing." Every more and more people are getting destroyed is what's happening.
Absolutely. And this is true not just in the dramatic ways that like
Absolutely.
turmoil plays out. I mean, think about, we're about to go through the holidays. And so, think about Uncle Joe is coming to the holidays, and Uncle Joe loves to bring up politically polarizing conversations at the dinner table. And if you already know you do not have the emotional capacity to
That's right.
stay calm in a charged conversation like that,
Mhm.
then boundaries will help you communicate in advance that he's free to do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
But if this, then this. And
Mhm.
so here's how I would have that conversation. Uncle Joe, I love how you keep up with current events in this world. And I know when you bring things up, it's because you want to process it and you love the emotional charge of intense conversations.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I have to let you know I do not have the emotional capacity right now
Mm.
for really hard conversations. And so you're free to do what you want. If you bring up those subjects, though, I just want to let you know in advance, I will need to excuse myself and walk away. And
Yeah.
it's not because I'm being disrespectful, and it's not because I'm not interested in you. It's because I cannot tolerate those conversations right now. I just don't have the emotional capacity for it. So,
Yeah.
do you see how you're giving him freedom? You're not trying to control him, manipulate him, you're not trying to punish him.
That's right.
But you are trying to hold yourself together. See, boundaries don't shove another person away. Healthy boundaries hold us together so that I can stay self-controlled. Otherwise, if I sit at that dinner table, the topic gets brought up, I run the risk of getting angry, frustrated, and having a reaction that betrays the best of who I really am.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing too, like, when you talk about it, I think a lot of people, when we actually will go ahead and have the conversation that we're really fearful of having in a kind manner, just as you did, people most of the time are actually more receptive than we think, but I think that a lot of times we're just thinking about what's gonna happen around the dinner table, and
Yes,
that's the person we're waiting to show up when we have the conversation.
that's right. And there's something important to note. Healthy people respect healthy boundaries.
True.
My counselor says an unhealthy person has never met a boundary that they like.
It's true.
So, where I have to personally challenge myself, and I guess it's time for a confession. Are you ready for a personal confession by Lisa?
I'm ready.
Okay, my personal confession. I get afraid that if I draw this boundary, that this other person could potentially reject me,
Oh, yeah.
misunderstand me, judge me, or walk away from me.
Mm.
And then one day it occurred to me, if I put a healthy boundary in place and this person walks away, chances are, whether I draw the boundary or not, I already know they're the kind of person that will walk away.
Mm.
And sometimes when I give an excuse for my lack of boundaries, I'll say, well, it's just because I'm trying to keep everybody happy, and that's people
Yeah,
pleasing. But if I'm honest, I don't people please just to keep everyone happy. I sometimes slip into people pleasing, trying to keep other people happy because I'm afraid if I don't keep them happy, they will take something away from me that
Mhm.
they provide for me that I'm not sure I'll be okay
Yeah,
without. We will always desperately want from other people what we fear we will never get from God.
it's so true.
And
Oh,
if we fear that that person will take their acceptance or take their love away from us because we attempt to draw a healthy boundary, then for me, what that means is I've forgotten. I need to step into that conversation carrying with me the ultimate acceptance and the ultimate love. I am already accepted and I'm already loved by God. So I need to work from that place of acceptance and love, not work for and hustle for and demand and shy away from boundaries for that other person's love and acceptance,
mhm.
because that creates real dysfunction and real unhealthy dynamics in a relationship.
Yeah, and you're not a mean person if you make those choices to do that. That's something that I've had to tell myself and even tell other people as they have asked me questions about why some of the boundaries I've set up. So tell me this, have you ever had a boundary set on you? And, what was your response to that? Maybe even so then versus how you view it now.
Great question. Yes, I have had some really healthy boundaries that my adult kids have
Mhm,
expressed. And I think 5 years ago, it would have offended me. I would have taken it
mm,
personally. I would have thought to myself, well, fine, you do that, and then I'm going to do this. And I would have had an unhealthy response to it.
yeah.
But now, they had a healthy boundary. They communicated that they would prefer in going through all of the heartbreak and hurt of the divorce that I not make comments about their dad.
Mhm,
And that is such a healthy boundary.
it is.
And so at first I was like, wow, that's going to be hard because things keep happening. And, I want to process those things. But when my kids said that, I realized it's not going to be helpful to process those things with them.
Yeah,
I can process that with my counselor. I can process that with close, trusted friends. I don't need to process that with my kids because they're already going through their own deep heartbreak.
yes.
And I don't want to add to that. So I respected that boundary and I'm
Mhm,
so glad I did. I think it has made my relationship with my kids as I've walked through this so much better. And
yeah,
I think they trust me and they see the health in that. And that's a blessing. So
yeah.
boundaries are not always hard. Boundaries are sometimes really, really good.
Yeah, I mean, they really are, and I've said this to my sister. I'm like, my dad may not have been the greatest husband, but my dad for me was a good dad. And
Mhm.
so I don't want to be put in the same I don't need to view him the same because the
Right.
relationship is not the same, although we're all impacted.
Yes.
And so that but yeah, I mean, there's different views there. I know people struggle with it so much, but, kudos to you for listening and following through, even if it wasn't easy, right?
And you know what? I don't do it perfectly.
None of us do.
But there's a big difference between a mistake, which we all make, and a pattern of behavior which should not be tolerated.
Yeah.
And so I think that's boundaries establish a way for the mistakes not to turn into unhealthy patterns.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's close out with this. You write quite a bit about healthy honesty, and we've talked about that to some degree already. But I mean, I'm even thinking someone's in a really unhealthy place right now, but it's not at a place where their relationship is going to be totally, it's not a goodbye. What is the value of that healthy honesty? What do you even mean by that? And maybe even how would you say God defines healthy honesty?
Well, I think we have to remember that we cannot confuse the good command to love with the bad behavior of enabling dynamics in a relationship that should not be enabled or perpetuated.
Mhm.
And so, in Good Boundaries and Goodbyes, I write a lot of scripts for people so that
Yeah,
because sometimes it's not setting the boundary that's hard, it's communicating the
it's
boundary
true.
that becomes really challenging. So the scripts are going to be really, really helpful for people. But even more than that, I work through some of those verses that make us hesitant to believe that drawing a boundary could be good, and
Mm,
make us less hesitant to be honest about what we can and cannot tolerate, what we will and will not accept, what we do and do not have to give. So
mhm,
I think when we have the biblical confidence, we can approach it with more honesty because we know that boundaries are not unbiblical and that God has already established that boundaries are not just a good idea, they're a God idea.
mhm.
So I'll leave you with this verse. Sometimes people are hesitant with boundaries, especially Christians, because they say, yeah, but didn't Jesus lay down his life for his friends? Yes, Jesus did. But Jesus laid down his life for a high and holy purpose. He did not lay down his life to enable bad behavior to continue.
That's right. Ah, it's so yeah, that's a good place to end. Um, Lisa, I'm thankful for this book. I know it wasn't easy to write. I know it's not easy to be in the position that you're in to constantly be asked questions. And so thank you for doing it.
You're so welcome. It's always a joy. And, we'll just say to be continued.
That's right. Always until the day of Christ Jesus is what I say.
That's right. That's right.